60% of branding is driven by perception and only 40% by the actual product and service. But actual 85% is actually driven by emotions. And in order for you to have a positive response in your target audience, you need to have...
Lorraine Carter is a global brand strategist and the founder of Persona Design.
With years of experience helping businesses, she specializes in making brand strategy accessible, powerful, and profitable.
In this episode, she reveals the secrets to building a brand that stands out, commands a premium, and creates deep emotional connections.
Let's say a podcaster is, either starting a podcast or has a few episodes live already, but is really trying to map out, okay, this is going to be my brand.
If people are not well aligned, they can actually unintentionally sabotage the overall business brand. So it's not unusual. You're going to really struggle to build anything that's going to have meaningful resonance in the marketplace. You're going to put a lot of energy into something that's going to deliver you very poor results in terms of looking at, how well aligned are you to the brand or not? And how can you enhance those alignments so that your key strengths and what I call wow power stands out, but it stands out in a way that benefits both you and your personal brand and the organizational brand.
If I seriously pay attention to my brand for my podcast, what am I going to gain from this?
If you build a really strong, robust brand, you build a lot of credibility and trust in what you have to offer, you're strongly differentiated, you can command a...
Lorraine, why does branding even matter?
Branding matters, and I'm talking about brand strategy here, not just the aesthetics of a logo, website and brochure or any visual asset. I'm talking about brand because it actually aligns and works in alignment with your business strategy to drive and underpin all the rationale around your commercial decisions, the culture of your organization, how you're actually going to reach out to the marketplace, who your target audience is, what your core differentiators are, how you're going to execute on your design assets. All of that comes into brand strategy. So if you just launch into all the really exciting visual stuff, you're making decisions that are entirely subjective, with no commercial rationale behind it and no clear reason that's driven by what's happening in your competitor landscape, what matters to your target audience. That's what underpins a brand. And that's why brand is so important if you want to stand out, be different, credible, differentiated, and lovable.
Lovable. Is it the objective to be lovable?
You can be lovable or likable. It depends on what kind of brand persona you have. But you do have to be likable because 60% of branding is driven by perception and only 40% by the actual product and service. Actual 85% is actually driven by emotions. And in order for you to have a positive response in your target audience, you need to be triggering an emotional response that's relevant to them. And that means you've got to at least be likable.
I love that. So I'm, let's say, very religiously following the content of one of my favorite content creators. And he defines brand as association, right? Which can be positive or negative, actually. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that? What do you think about brand is an association of ideas and concepts, right?
I think of brand in terms of, if we're going to put this in comparable terms of, if your brand is safe and in the middle and a bit vanilla and not strongly associated with anything that's triggering an emotional response or associated with something that's a strong opinion, or you hang your flag on as a really compelling issue. If you're just playing it safe down the middle, you're just going to blend in with all the other noise. So if you want to stand out for something that's a real driver, as far as your target audience is concerned, then you've got to be a little bit polarizing. You've got to have what I call that love or hate factor, or for anybody who's from the UK, the Marmite factor. There's no middle ground. You either love Marmite or you dislike it because it's such a strongly flavored product. There isn't really any middle ground on that one. So you got to have your Marmite factor. And if you look at any of the strong brands out there, they really stand for something that their target audience resonates with. So to give you an example, if I'm running a leadership working session, or if I'm even running an open brand strategy program, And I ask those participating, give me a show of hands, who loves Android and who loves iPhone. I will typically have an even split down the room. And I will then ask people, well, why do you have a preference? And I will get very compelling arguments on both sides of the equation.
Wouldn't you like everybody to love your brand though? Wouldn't that be the point?
No, because at the end of the day, if we are building anything, whether it's a product or service, tangible, or whether it's something we productize and we're selling entirely online, we all have a core target audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the target audience that loves what you have to offer so much, because ultimately you want to build a brand that you can command a premium and where your ideal target audience is so thrilled with what you have to offer, it enhances their life or it solves a problem or it does something that they just need and want. If you want a core target audience that is not making a decision based on price. So
right.
If you are, like, to give you two examples of brands, and I'm picking brands here that people are going to be largely familiar with, regardless of where they're listening in from around the world. So if we take, for example, Harley Davidson, well-known global motorbike brand.
Yeah.
Their core target audience has a particular persona that we're all familiar with, bikers in black leather or shirtless denim jackets. They might have a nice grizzly beard. But actually, that's the persona, and it's all about the open road, freedom of the open road. But actually, their most profitable target audience is actually the highly paid executive who's suited up, particularly working in professional service or finances. And at the weekend, he or she, typically he, is dropping the suit, hanging it up, and on go the leathers or the denim. And that is the audience that will buy without even giving too much consideration around what that price is. So it's not about the reliability of the bike, it's about the whole persona of what it's associated with and what it stands for, freedom of the open road. But if the middle core target audience in the persona wasn't strongly associated with that, it would be a lot less appealing to what is actually the most profitable audience. So let's come back to another totally different brand. And I've already mentioned this one, but I'm going to reference it again because it's so broadly known. So if we take Apple, Apple started off as very much a professional product before it moved into the consumer space. Indeed. And it was the product of the creative industry. So whether it was design, media, that's where it sat. But actually, then when Apple moved into the consumer space and producing consumer products, which enabled it to sell much higher volumes, it still commanded a price premium because the persona of the brand is tied up in all that prestige and cachet of being associated with a creative type of profile. So, because you could argue that, whether you're buying an other brand without naming any in particular, that's maybe 20% of the price. But the argument will come back to, well, why is a customer prepared to pay so much more? And it's because of what the whole brand stands for. Its persona, its ease of use, its whole integrated closed system, and it's what it's associated with in terms of a premium usage audience. So they still have that audience sitting at the core, but their real driver on volume and profit at a premium price point is actually a consumer base.
So how do you think Harley Davidson does it to make you think about those grizzly beard, jacked, very manly, all leather suited guys on the motorbikes on an open free road? But actually, that's not where the real money is for them. How do you do that as a brand? Because I think that's a very interesting topic for podcasters. Like, how do you show yourself up as something or somebody, or catering to a specific audience, or giving the illusion, the perception that you're catering to a specific audience? Actually, the money is elsewhere. And it's probably, if I start answering to that question, but I want your take on it, Lorraine, you want to make sure that people feel that they are impersonating this target audience by buying this type of products. How do you do that?
That comes back to being really clear about who your target audience is. So fundamentally, one of the absolutely essential things you need to do is get really clear on mapping out your different target audiences. So even a modestly resourced business could have anything between 3 to 6, what I call purchaser personas or customer avatars. And in order to understand where the biggest commercial revenue is, you have to map out your target audience. And you also have to understand the emotional drivers around why they are buying. because we have to come back to the fact that human beings are irrational and they make a lot of very emotional based decisions. So understanding what it is that's the thing that is of most importance to that individual and speaking to that person as an individual, not as a mass market consumer. So when you understand what that purchaser is looking for, then you tailor your communications and your messaging frameworks to resonate with them. And you're looking at how, and you are obviously engaging with them in the channels that are most relevant to where they are.
I think that does make sense. So that's specifically gathered, sorry, to companies' brand, right?
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell me about personal brands?
So when we look at personal branding, we are looking at it always in terms of, are the people in the business, in the organization, aligned well with what the overall corporate entity or business brand is? Because if people are not well aligned, they can actually unintentionally sabotage the overall business brand. So it's not unusual. In fact, I frequently would have to do this, whereby we might have done work around the overall business entity brand, or it might be the product or service brand. And then we will look at, well, who are the key voices in the business at a leadership level and then a general broader team level, in terms of looking at, well, how well aligned are you to the brand or not? And how can you enhance those alignments so that your key strengths and what I call wow power stands out, but it stands out in a way that benefits both you and your personal brand and the organizational brand. So you're identifying what are your key strengths, what are those go-to things that your colleagues and customers really appreciate and that you're best known for, and how you amplify that in a really positive way. If you're a leader in an organization, your role can be even more important because you're effectively the voice at a leadership level of the brand. You're representing it. But then also, so are your customer facing and your sales team. And then you also have what I call your hidden sales force, your broader staff, who may not be in a sales role, but they are actually part of the whole organization. They're really important. So if somebody behaves in an inappropriate way, and that's associated with the organization, it can be very damaging from a reputation point of view. So it's actually quite important to look at overall personal brand development aligned with the organizational brand, as opposed to personal brand in the sense of some of the things that are less strategic, but also do still have importance around, say, physically how you appear. Those are important, but we always look at the strategic issues first. And then it is important in terms of how you show up that's relevant and appropriate, so you're not making your customers feel uncomfortable. So if you're working in a very formal environment where you are dressed in a very traditional way, well, then your customers are, well, then it typically is going to be behoven on you to reflect that back so the customer is as comfortable. But at the same time, if you're in a very chilled out, relaxed, maybe tech environment, casual dress, well, then you can just leave the suit at home. So it's all about appropriateness in the context of the brand, what it stands for, but also your target audience.
So that makes me think of the fact that, so there is a saying that got tweaked in the meantime, but it used to be, people buy from people they like. And I like to take it even shorter, which is, people buy from people, not from companies. What role, does the brand play in allowing you to sell to a person that feels connected to another person rather than buying from a company or being sold by a company, which is even worse?
The people of an organization actually bring the brand to life in terms of behavior. And ultimately, the relationships are built, as you've described, in a human-to-human factor. And then that's all like the halo effect then of association and alignment with the brand entity. So they actually go hand in hand, because the reputation of the brand in the business reflects on the individual as much as the individual's behavior, engagement, resonance, representation reflects on the business entity brand. So to give you an example of what that can mean, so I was dealing with a very high profile leadership individual responsible for close to 10,000 people in the team. And she had decided that she was moving on to doing something else. And she reflected to me, she made this observation. She said, Lorraine, at the moment, I've only just got to pick up the phone or give the nod somewhere, And that has massive clout in terms of how the marketplace responds. But she said, once I step away from this brand, I'm under no illusion as to how much my personal brand carries in weight. It carries weight at a much higher level because of the alignment of the two together. But when I move away from this big entity, I will still have my own personal reputation, but it won't have the same level of power as it has aligned with this big corporate entity brand. And that's where the two work hand in hand. The fundamental fact is, you're absolutely right. It's all about the relationship, the personality, the engagement. So this is why I always talk about humanizing brands. Making them, and when we look at brands and when we develop them, map them out, we think of them as humanized entities, because that's how we all make sense of the world. That's how we engage. That's how we respond emotionally at a subconscious level.
Yeah.
So bringing that human element in is actually critical.
So let's bring it back to podcasters then, Lorraine. Let's say a podcaster is, either starting a podcast or has a few episodes live already, but is really trying to map out, okay, this is going to be my brand. I have the podcasters, myself, the person, but this is what I want my brand to represent. This is the level of association that I want to have. This is the polarization that I want to have. Back to your own terms at the beginning of this episode. Where do I start?
The first strategic question I would pose, and I would pose this to anybody building any kind of product, service, business entity or podcast, is, what are your longer term strategic objectives? What do you want this to do for you? What's the reason for growing this podcast audience? And how do you want it to serve you? Is it something that you want to use to market yourself as an individual? Or do you want to build the strength of your audience and the product that you offer so that it becomes something of standalone value that you could potentially sell? So if that's something that you're looking at, that you want to build as an asset with intellectual property that you want to sell, then you are better off building that brand as a standalone entity rather than wrapping it up entirely in your name and your individual personal persona. If you want to make it all about yourself and build your profile and your personal brand, then you can make it about yourself. So it's a strategic decision to decide, is it going to be a standalone entity, or is it going to be all about the personal brand of the individual? Because that will then determine how you're going to develop the brand strategically.
So that does make sense. Can you give me some tactical ways to go about that though? So say I have my pen and paper and I'm like, okay, this is what I want my brand to represent. But where do I start? Where do I start to be able to say, this is what I want my brand associated with because my long-term goal is XYZ, so that right now I need to do ABC? How does that work?
Okay, if you're stepping back from this, and the top level things that I would recommend if you're starting out with leaner resources rather than a large organization, when we're looking at mapping out brands, it's typically 12 areas we look at. And I pare that back when we're starting with leaner resources. So come back to the baseline, first of all, of psychology of influence. Who is your target audience? What are their needs? What are their pain points and challenges? What are their pleasure points? And what is it you're going to do to fulfill those needs, depending on whether they're coming to you to have problem solve. So it could be health related, and they're coming to you for very specific problems related to, let's say, pregnancy. And so the persona you're going to build around that is going to be built very much around those issues. So you're looking at what are the areas that matter most, and you need to map that out for your target audiences. You also then need to look at, well, gap analysis. Who else in the marketplace is also talking about similar aspects of what I want to talk about? And how are they approaching it? So you're doing some market research to evaluate, because there's no point you doing somebody else who's already well established. You've got to put your own slant and angle on it. You've got to bring something different to the table for people to want to come and listen to you. Otherwise, they're just going to listen to the more established offering. So you've got to bring your angle to it. So you've got to do some baseline gap analysis on where those opportunities lie. Where can you put your particular slant on it? You also got to look at, well, who are our core target audience? Do we have three core target audience, maybe two that we are targeting, and map them out? Get a real understanding of all the different aspects of what matters to them most and what they're going to get out of your podcast. Topics. Is it a long form podcast where you are producing content over a 2 or 3 hour period? Is it something that's shorter, that's 30 or 40 minute slot? How's it gonna, what do you envision the listening experience being like for your listeners, and how do they get value out of that? Then another thing you're looking at, well, how are you going to productize your offering? How are you going to, because it's not just about, say, planning out 12 to 16 week content. You can look at, well, how else am I going to productize that in terms of how it's going to serve the audience? Is it just something that's overall newsworthy, or am I going to break it up into different chunks where we dive into key aspects of this overarching topic, and then we break it up with other elements of it that might be lighter or more detailed? So productizing your offering. Then you've also got to look at, well, what's your fundamental value proposition? How do you stand out? Actually, succinctly develop your value proposition so it's memorable and referable, and something that a 7 or 8 year old can easily remember if it's rolled off. And then what's the story behind why you're doing this? Why are you bringing it to market? Because people remember stories 22 times more effectively than facts and figures. So if you've got a nice, compelling story around what you're doing, why you're doing it, why you brought it to market, then people will, your target audience should resonate with that. And then you also need to look at, what's the overall personality of this brand going to be, my podcast brand? Is it going to be formal? Are we wise sage or gurus with kind of maybe an academic approach to everything we talk about? Or are we a bit tongue-in-cheek, and do we have a fun approach? Or are we going to be really edgy, newsworthy? You got to decide how what your personality is aligned with the topic that you're going to. So you're mapping out the personality of your brand, not you personally, the brand itself. And then the other thing that's really important that comes into that is, what are the signature language that you're going to repeatedly use? So you become known for certain things that you say. It becomes part of your messaging frameworks. It's going to become part of how you actually market your podcast. It's going to reoccur frequently in terms of how you deal with certain issues or topics. So those are the 7 or 8 things that are kind of the essentials that somebody needs to think about, map it out, document it, so they can build some sense of a frame around what their brand looks like and how it's going to behave in the world.
Few things I want to follow up on here. What does that look like on the day-to-day? So I map out, okay, I have, let's call it 2 target audiences that I want to understand the pain points of, the desired outcomes of, and I think you said the pleasure points as well, which is an interesting one. It's something I didn't think of. So you map that out. You're like, okay, those people like this, and that. They fear or get pain from this, and that. So those are the precise points I'm going to hit on because I want to be, catering to the needs of this specific audience. How do you deploy that on the day-to-day? Because I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to have to, for a podcast, for instance, I'm going to have to record episodes on a weekly basis, at least, right? Yeah. Do I always bear that in mind and potentially only talk about those 3-4 pain points and 3-4 desired outcomes and 3-4 pleasure points? Or how do you navigate and how do you potentially evolve your brand over time, right? It's like, what does it look like?
You're not necessarily always talking overtly about those pleasure or pain points, but you are bringing in parallels and nuances around it. So you're building a brand is all about consistency.
Yeah.
And that applies to every kind of brand, whether it's a podcast brand or a fintech or a SaaS brand.
Yeah.
You got to have consistency. So, but that doesn't mean you have to overtly talk about a really strong pain point. But you can, if you're clever and you're mapping out the content, and you would do this, same principle would apply if you were building a really robust blog. Same principles apply.
Indeed.
Because it's again about knowledge transfer and sharing information in a different medium format. So you're looking at, well, then how do I make sure that I'm consistently addressing one of those issues?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be full on overt. Sometimes you can really go full on and deal with an issue. Then other times you can deal with things that are more on the periphery of it. But you need to be consistent.
That makes 100% sense. So if I start building my brand, and you mentioned something interesting in there as well, which is, are there other actors in the space? Do you want to absolutely differentiate, or the fact that you're gonna mix your brand with your own personality, right? At the end of the day, it's also in personal brand, there is brand, but also personal.
Yeah.
So do you absolutely want to differentiate from what is already existing on the market? Or can you go for more or less the same thing, just add your own touch? How do you navigate that?
You do need to differentiate, because the marketplace is so competitive that if you're only slightly different and your competitor has a well-established audience, people are already conditioned to go and listen to that channel. So it's going to be their first go-to channel. So you might get one listening opportunity with a listener. They'll have listened to 10 others from your competitors. So you've got to have something compelling for them to go, that was really interesting. I want to go back and listen to what else that person has to say. And I really like the kind of guests they're having on here. They're not necessarily as obvious as ones I might have thought. They're bringing a different slant to it that I hadn't thought of before. And that's a really interesting perspective, because it's all about stimulating curiosity, fulfilling a need around certain information. It all comes back to, at the end of the day, it's knowledge transfer, it's sharing information, it's sharing a perspective. And then it's depending on what kind of podcast you have. I mean, you could have a podcast that specializes in classical guitar.
Why not?
With a very niche specialist audience.
Here we go.
So it comes back to, well, who are you targeting? Is it classical guitar players with a strong Spanish influence?
So, it's so funny you would say that. Yesterday I had a call with a couple of podcasters who want to take their podcast to the next level. And it's a podcast about the Ford Mustang Fox Body 5.0 from 19 something whatsoever.
Sorry, run that by me again. I didn't quite catch that.
That's the point. That's exactly my point. It's like, and I told them, I was like, guys, the thing I love in my job is that I get to talk to such amazing people. I'm not that much into car. I guess it shows. And it's like, I could imagine there is an automotive podcast, right? Like there are plenty of them actually. I could even imagine like a race car or vintage car podcast. Maybe even a brand specific podcast, right? So like Mustang or Ford podcast. But like a single car model podcast. And the crazy thing is that they were getting like 7,000 downloads per month and about 4,000 or 5,000 views on YouTube per month.
Wow.
And it's like,
and that's for a single model of car.
They just talk about one single model. The Fox
and is
body.
It like a collector's car? It's not a modern car.
No, it's not a model car. It's a vintage car for sure.
Okay.
And I'm like, I love this. And it's like, it shows that, as you said, right, we are in such a competitive landscape. You have 1% of podcasts that rip like 90% of downloads, obviously. So you need to be niche if you want to, you need to differentiate. I was like, that's such an extreme level of differentiation. And they are therefore getting very good downloads.
Of course.
So it's like, I found it so funny. So the way you pointed it for the guitar thing, I'm like, that's so spot on. So Lorraine, I would like you to hit a bit on the pain points and the desired outcomes of people with and without a brand. So let's start with the painful one.
Yeah.
What could it mean for my podcast or my business behind the podcast if I didn't pay attention to my brand?
I think you're going to really struggle to build anything that's going to have meaningful resonance in the marketplace. You're going to put a lot of energy into something that's going to deliver you very poor results.
Boom.
And that principle applies across whether you're building a podcast or you're building a service brand online for an e-commerce product.
Bullets fired.
Yeah.
What will be the benefits if I seriously pay attention to my brand for my podcast and what's behind it? What am I gonna gain from this?
If you build a really strong, robust brand, you're strongly differentiated, you build a lot of credibility and trust in what you have to offer, you can command a premium then, because most podcasts, when they're successful, look to drive and grow revenue through some format or another, whether they're selling something directly or whether it's through collaborative partnerships with advertising. But you're looking to develop some sort of a revenue base. That revenue base is going to be proportionally better for the strength of your brand.
Mhm.
So if you have a really strong brand, you can command a premium. If you have a strong brand and you want to partner with high profile brands, there's the halo effect between the two of you in terms of the revenue that can be generated, either through advertising or through selling product. It all
Amen.
comes back to the strength of the brand enables you to command a premium. And if your objective is to grow and develop revenue, then you've got to look at how strong is your brand and how are you going to build your strategy around that in order to be able to achieve and command that revenue base.
So, Lorraine, let me ask you this. What is your brand?
Persona design and my brand is all about making brand strategy accessible to more leanly resourced businesses without big marketing teams. So while we still work with very large enterprise organizations, the EU, we also work with more modestly resourced ones. And I fundamentally am very much driven by making brand strategy accessible to businesses that might have only 10 to 25 people, making it accessible. So you do not need your MBA in marketing to be able to map out, develop your brand and deploy it effectively. And so I've worked with countless numbers of businesses to enable them to do that, to build a robust brand. So my vision is to enable 1 million businesses and the ripple effect of that to build really strong brands that has the knock-on effect of enabling and support. Because fundamentally, small businesses, SME businesses, are the backbone to our communities and society. Yeah. They're the biggest employers. If we don't have a healthy SME base in a democratic capitalist society, then the whole of the society suffers. So in order for us to have a healthy, functioning society where everybody is lifted, part of that is then, my vision is to enable those business owners, those founders, those smaller businesses to be successful. So it's knowledge transfer and giving them structures and frameworks in order to be able to do that.
Something that I've learned in sales is when you give the price, you want the like that's more than what I thought. Like that's where the negotiation starts. That's where the sales starts. It's like if you don't get it means like you're too cheap and you're not you're not applying the right money to your value. And what I was just thinking when you were telling me about your brand, Lorraine, was like that applies also to people's objectives and ambitions. Yeah. Like I want to help 1 million businesses grow, develop, and have an impactful brand. And I was like, but that's cool. Like, it's cool to have such an objective. I don't know how you're going to manage that, but I'm for sure going to follow it. And that's great. Like, brand at scale, love that. And EU, indeed, that's not too bad of a name to drop when talking about the people you help. So it shows that definitely the brand is working. Lorraine, if people want to find out more about you, engage with you, where should they go?
They can reach me on personadesign.ie, and of course, they'll also find me on LinkedIn. So that's the easiest way to reach out to me.
Fantastic. We'll put all the links in the description. Lorraine, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure, Guillaume, and I hope that your listeners get some value out of our chat.
They will, definitely. Thank you, Lorraine.